Welcome once again. Today we're studying a long passage, Judges chapter 9 verse 1 to chapter 10 verse 5. So I hope that you have your Bibles open so as to be best able to follow, as there's a lot we can learn from this passage. And as with all my other studies, there are questions at the end for further reflection, either on your own or with a group of friends. This is a passage that's perplexed many Christians. Not that the story is difficult to follow. Many similar contemporary stories could be told. No, rather the difficulty lies in this very fact, that it is such a worldly story, and it seems that the Lord has little or no part in it. He's only mentioned twice. But this is in fact the whole point. Here we are given a description of the people of God estranged from him. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that this chapter describes the consequences of God abandoning his people to the full consequences of the choices that they made for themselves. In fact, the story has already begun by the time this chapter begins. The individualism of our modern society causes us to ignore both the testimony of the Bible and experience. We deceive ourselves into thinking that our failings are only our own. The reality is very different. What we are in private will inevitably affect what we are in public, and our failings and mistakes will invariably affect our dependence, since few seem able to entirely shake off their heritage. And this lesson is vividly illustrated here. The last verses of chapter 8 identified 3 of Gideon's failings. He adopted a kingly lifestyle. He took up an immoral way of life. He engaged in multiple marriages, especially forbidden to rulers, and married a Canaanite with whom he did not cohabit. All these actions were forbidden to Israelites. And he was ensnared by false religious practices. He may have been, as Jerubbaal, the Baal fighter, as he's named here, and have effectively restrained Baal worship. However, the consequences of his own failure in leadership made it almost inevitable that no sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites would prostitute themselves to the Baals, as we've already been told at the end of the last chapter. Immediately chapter 9 opens, we're made aware how these failings had severe consequences in the generation that followed him. Because Gideon had begun to adopt a kingly lifestyle, his death issued in an attempt to establish a dynastic rule, and by means of methods which remain even to this day so often prevalent. And his immorality meant that there was little resistance to the adoption of immoral practices. The chapter is characterized throughout by thoroughly godless actions. Finally, the snare of the ephod that Gideon had made had undermined the people's resistance to false religion. The moral and spiritual life of the people of God lay in ruins. We may not be Gideons, but in our homes, workplaces and our fellowships we can have just as devastating an effect upon those around us. Our failure to adopt a consistent Christian lifestyle and to manifest the fruit of the Spirit can have a far greater and more damaging effect than we ever realize. We need to learn the lesson of this chapter, and to learn it well, and pray for grace to be faithful. Before we proceed further, we should notice that the Israelites are described as worshipping Baal Berith, the deity at Shechem, where there was a great tree and pillar where Abimelech was recognized as king. Now this was the very site where Joshua set up the pillar as a monument to remind the people of the Lord's covenant with them, a permanent reminder that the Lord was their king. It was also the place where the tabernacle had been set up by Joshua. An added irony is the fact that Baal Berith means Baal of the covenant. Since Shechem was a city where Israelites, Canaanites and mixed-race people such as Abimelech himself lived together, the evidence points towards the cult of Baal Berith being a mixture of Baal worship and the veneration of the Lord. Here was a pick and mix religion, which the people had devised from what seemed the best bits of the two faiths. It was a natural departure point from true worship, for it did not involve outright rejection of the worship of God. But thus the worship of Baal Berith provided a consumer-driven religion, with God there to do his job as and when required. It was comfortably multi-faith, taking that claim to exclusivism which might lead to it being branded with intolerance. We can also see how Gideon's religious failures opened the door to the people moving in such a direction. Now, the last thing a worshipper of Baal Berith wants is one who contends against it. Those who are tolerant in religion are usually very intolerant of intolerance. Gideon had a nickname, Jerubbaal, which, as we have seen, means Baal fighter. Small wonder then that Abimelech sought to destroy all those who might have sought to uphold the old paths, the 70 of Jerubbaal's sons. No surprise either that the project to eliminate them was funded from the temple of Baal Berith. With the clinching argument that I am your flesh and blood, Abimelech succeeded in winning the full support of the Shechemites. With temple money funding the local mafia thugs, Gideon's family were soon eliminated on one stone, surely a reference to a sacrifice to Baal, made by means of human offerings. Are we intended to see a macabre echo here? Just as Gideon began his judgeship with an offering to the Lord, Abimelech, the anti-judge, sets out on his rule with a human sacrifice to Baal. The abandonment of the Lord's ways quickly leads to the adoption of worldly standards and increasingly depraved conduct. Modern Baal Beriths are no more able to stop such trends as the cult which flourished in Abimelech's time. One of Gideon's sons, Jotham, escaped the carnage. As a final act of defiance before he fled from Abimelech and passed from the pages of Scripture, he ascended the hill of Gerizim. There, overlooking the city and making full use of the acoustics, he uttered a speech which culminated in a curse. There may be some significance in the fact that according to Deuteronomy 27 and 28, Israel were to gather on the two hills of Ebal and Gerizim and proclaim from one to the other the blessings and the curses of God's covenant with them. Oddly, Gerizim was to be the hill from which the blessings were to be declared. Is this intended to be ironic? Did Jotham intend to convey the idea that God's blessings would become curses for the Shechemites? Or did he imply that if the people learnt from his speech, it would become a blessing to them? As so often in Judges, we're left with tantalizing questions. We cannot be sure. Jotham began with a fable which is intended as a call to the people to act according to the light of truth and demonstrate the integrity that flows from such obedience. This, he suggests, the people have failed to do. And with wisdom he recognizes that if his verdict is correct, and he's little doubt that it is, then Abimelech and Shechem will self-destruct. At this point, Jotham has grasped the fundamental nature of life, which is out of step with the Lord. Sin by its very nature is divisive, as events in the Garden of Eden amply demonstrated. It has no cohesive power. Consequently, left to itself, sin destroys itself as its followers turn upon themselves. We shall have reason to refer to this again in a few moments. And yet Jotham's speech seems flawed. Abimelech sought the throne of at least part of Israel. That's obvious enough. But we need also to notice that Jotham's fable does not revert to the view expressed by his father that the Lord will rule over you. He does not seem to criticize the fact that the people are seeking a king, only that they have asked the wrong person. In this respect, therefore, both Abimelech and Jotham are no better than one another. They have both forgotten the one who rules Israel. This is so often true today. The rule of faith, the Bible, is often ignored. People do what they want. When churches come to make decisions, it's seldom true that uppermost in their minds is what does the king want. Far more often we press our own party line to selfishly press our own views. Even our decision-making systems can be a snare, since we can find a way through without finding the will of the Lord. The Bible is no great advocate of democracy as the means of finding the Lord's will. Rather, it advocates a spiritual sensitivity to the mind of Christ. He is King. Generally throughout the Bible, leadership is charismatic. That means it is the result of the gift of God, not human appointment. The judges had all been these sort of men and women, but Abimelech and perhaps Jotham sought to institutionalize the leadership of God's people. And though people were ready to make and change their choices, rather than look to the one who God would appoint. The consequences were, of course, tragic. Since the leaders were appointed by the people, they could be changed at their whim. Since in this way the wrong people were appointed, they adopted unspiritual methods to achieve their ends. They were appointed by those who were dominated by self-interest and unconcern for the glory of God, and they themselves conducted themselves in the same way. Disaster and division speedily followed. Again, we need to notice how readily we fall into the same trap. Office in the church is to be manifested in service, not self-advancement. Appointment is to be made not simply to fill up vacancies or to ensure our party is represented, but because God has equipped those who he has called. Office is not to be jealously guarded either. We are to be jealous only for the Lord. The tactics of the boardroom have no place in the life of the church. Departure from the Lord's pattern always leads to disaster, to petty squabbling and power struggles which strangle the life out of a church. So we're not surprised by the sequel, for in the rest of the passage we are introduced to a people who devour one another. Significantly, a people who act in the way described here are not those to whom the Lord sends his Spirit, but an evil spirit. Thus, far from producing the fruit of the Spirit and keeping in step with the Spirit, they produced only what the Apostle Paul calls in Galatians 5:19-23, the acts of the sinful nature. The result was, as it always is, mutual destruction. The people sought to overthrow their leader they had appointed, and Abimelech sought to annihilate the very people over whom he ruled. In this way they experienced the wrath of God, the whiplash resulting from the perversion of God's way. It is strange, of course, to read that God sent an evil spirit, but this reminds us that when Satan acts, it's only with divine permission. However, there is more significance to the present reference than this. On the one hand, it offers a contrast to the earlier account where the Spirit came upon Gideon so that he could save God's people. Here, the evil spirit comes from God to punish them. On the other hand, the evil spirit who appeared at this point, in fact, only accelerates the process already taking place so as to shorten the period of self-destruction. As all this happened after a mere 3 years. In a paradoxical way, the sending of this evil spirit is an act of grace and mercy to the community of Israel. The nature of the conflict is unsurprising. History is littered with examples of revolutionary movements being hijacked by the more radical members who then liquidate their former colleagues. Thus, if Abimelech the half-Israelite sought to give fresh impetus to the syncretic Baal-Berith cult, Gaal reminded the Shechemites that their real religious roots lay further back in the full-blown paganism of a purebred Shechemite in Hamor. Gaal, of course, was obviously claiming purebred status for himself. And what is true politically is equally true spiritually. A Christian syncretism can only last for so long. Little by little in individual or society, the pagan element in human nature reasserts itself. Sin breeds greater sin, and eventually the total overthrow of any residual Christian influence and the restraint that it provides takes place. Thus Jotham's prediction comes to pass. Gaal, double-crossed by Zebul, is overthrown. Hopping mad with Shechem, Abimelech vents his anger on the total destruction of Shechem, and in so doing he kills about 1,000 men and women who'd taken refuge in the temple tower of El Berith. So much for the power of this God to save his people. And thus, of course, does Baal prove again his utter impotence to defend his own. But persistence darkens the ability of the mind to think. So Abimelech becomes a fool. Not content with the destruction of Shechem, he turns on apparently innocent Thebez, but only to get stoned by a woman. Now, to be killed by a woman signified utter disgrace in the ancient world, hence Abimelech's response. Nevertheless, the woman did administer the fatal blow. Moreover, we note that stoning was the prescribed mode of capital punishment in the Old Testament, the means by which a person was declared spiritually a non-person. Thus the career of the anti-judge or anti-king was brought to an end. But if God has been scarcely mentioned in this chapter, as men have gone their own way, this does not mean that he was not involved. With two words, thus God, the writer of the book of Judges indicates that God has been at work to deliver Israel from itself. For this is surely the point of this chapter. No enemy attacks from without. Here the enemy is within. And here, without any evidence that the people look to him for help, the Lord uproots the core of the evil from the very centre of the people's life. God emerges victorious, with Baal destroyed by his own followers. A final comment from one student brings this sorry episode to an appropriate end. All this, he says, however, blossomed from the seemingly minor compromises made by Gideon, the faithful warrior of God. Let us each of us pray that we do not make similar compromises, for it is our children who will pay if we do. But this is not the end of the story. This section of Judges ends with the mercy of God in raising up Tola and Jair at the beginning of chapter 10. Significantly, nothing is mentioned about their mighty acts of conquest or of the enemy. Is it being over-speculative to suggest that this is because their work was quiet and unspectacular? Does it suggest that they rebuilt Israel, but from within? This certainly seems very likely, and was doubtless much needed after the ravages of Abimelech's short reign. There may be hints that even these men were flawed. The size of Jair's family may suggest that he perhaps was modelling the exercise of his rule by pagan standards too. However, large families were regarded as a blessing from God in Old Testament times, and the fact that Jair and his sons travelled on donkeys suggests that he was a man of peace. Certainly the Lord seems to have used both he, his sons and Tola to reassert his rule until, sadly, the people were to forget him once again. We may, however, take great comfort from this. The Lord is always ready to help those who turn back to him. Sometimes, as here, he may even apparently take the initiative, though we must not, of course, presume upon him. Indeed, in another sense, it's only because he does this that we have any hope at all. For as someone says, in all fairness and honesty, Israel should not have survived. But hope there is, for in Bunyan's words we have here an account of grace abounding to the chief of sinners. This passage challenges us to two great tasks: to live consistent Christian lives, and to ensure that the Lord is King, above all, in our life, in fellowship with one another. To fail in either of these is to bring to nothing what has gone before, and to bring disaster upon us and those who follow us. May we find the grace to succeed.